Hello, podcast listeners. You are now listening to the Coffee, Health, and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Jordan River, and I want to thank you for tuning in today. Before we get started, I urge you to share the Coffee, Health, and Science Podcast. Spread the show. It's how we grow. It really helps us out a lot. Give us a good rating and review. Make sure you're subscribed. We love providing content here at the Coffee, Health, and Science Podcast. And today, we are back with show favorite, Dr. Coffee. What's up, my friend?
Hey, Jordansky, another day above ground living the dream.
That's right, man. That's right. I got my Purity coffee. Are you all caffeinated up? You got your coffee over there?
I am. I've already had a couple cups of hot, so I'm enjoying a nice cold brew right now.
Nice. I like how you switch it up. I love that, man. Listen, we've done some great explorations on this show. We've gone deep into a couple subjects multiple times. And today's another example of that, where we're turning back to an older topic, but diving in to some niche facets. I'm talking, of course, about caffeine. Caffeine comes up on the show all the time, and today we are diving back into caffeine and how it affects some other parts of life and the world, how it affects facets like pregnancy, how it affects hydration, a couple other things. It's a caffeine exploration today. How does that sound, Dr. Coffee?
Well, it sounds good, and it's really pertinent for me because I have a real challenge in life right now.
What's that?
So I went to my doctor for my physical, and he suggested that I don't drink caffeine after dinner.
Right? That's got to be a major challenge for you.
It is, because I've changed dinner till 11 o'clock at night. It's too hard to eat that late.
Exactly.
So I'm challenged. Anyway, that led me to really research caffeine to prove him wrong. And today we're going to talk about everything you wanted to know about caffeine.
I love it. I'm really interested in some of these topics for today. They're just less explored topics, maybe a little bit touchy, but here we are. We're diving right into them. The first one here, I want to talk about caffeine and pregnancy because this has been on my radar for a while, and I'm currently immersed in reading about first trimester pregnancies and women's taste for coffee. I'm hearing lots and lots of accounts that, you know, when the nausea sets in, coffee is one of the things that triggers it. And it was making me think, you know, when it comes to caffeine in pregnancy, when it comes to coffee in pregnancy, what are the current kind of protocols? What are your opinions, Dr. Coffee? And how does caffeine affect and coffee affect the health of the pregnancy?
So that's a great question, but it's a really big question.
Right.
And you really have to break it down. You mentioned the words first trimester, but I'm going to take that a step forward. So a step further, I mean. So we're going to break down pregnancy into five different levels rather than just 3 trimesters.
Oh, okay.
So we're going to break it down as follows. Preconception, post-conception, first trimester, second trimester, third trimester.
Okay.
So a husband and a wife decide they want to get pregnant. I hate to say this, but that is the time to limit or not use caffeine.
Oh, why is that? That's very fascinating.
So there's a lot of studies that show the first 2 weeks while you're getting pregnant, caffeine can increase the risk of lack of conception.
Oh, interesting. So in order to get pregnant, it might help to cut out the caffeine.
Yeah, the studies really show that women who consume more than 300 milligrams of caffeine each day had a 27% lower conception rate.
Whoa, that's pretty significant.
Non-users.
Whoa, wow.
It is. And that under 300 milligrams, there was a 10% lower risk of conceiving relative to non-users.
Okay.
This was actually a really good study. It did not have a lot of plagues of being a bad study, like some of the studies I read.
Right.
It was a true summation of what's going on. So
Mm.
I would recommend that when a husband and wife decide they're going to get pregnant, they limit or stay away from caffeine.
Wow. I don't know if I've ever heard you say those words, but very interesting. That is super, super interesting. And that's preconception, avoiding the caffeine.
Right. But, you just said you never heard me say those words. I have never demonized decaf coffee.
True.
I like decaf coffee, especially when I've gone way past my 500 milligrams of caffeine in a day. And, when I start hearing colors.
When you start really buzzing, that's when you know you got to turn it to decaf.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I just know you're a big proponent of the health effects of caffeine. So for you to say this means that it probably is very important.
It is. And now we're going to go into the next phase, which is what's called post-conception.
Mm-hmm.
So post-conception is defined as the first 2 weeks of pregnancy after a person's conceived, but usually don't know that they're pregnant.
So the hormones are just starting to change, and the pregnancy test probably hasn't even come yet. What's happening with the body, and what's happening with the body's reaction to coffee and caffeine?
Exactly. So what's going on is that it's the most sensitive period of all of pregnancy, and the risk of a embryo failing to implant during this time, which results in an early miscarriage, is at the highest rates during the whole pregnancy.
Right.
So people that have a high intake of caffeine during this time have a much greater risk of miscarriage.
Wow. And like you said, it's about that early stage. It's a high percentage there of, just basically failed implantations. So if you can up that chance, like if you're trying for a kid and here's something you can do to actually increase your chances, that's pretty significant.
It is. So a husband and wife say, okay, we want to get pregnant. That's the day that they decide that she's going to decrease caffeine usage or curtail caffeine usage. And we'll go into that a little deeper in a few minutes, because in my researching, there's some things that really are blaring at me. And then when she knows she's ready for fertilization, they try and have kids. And then for the next 2-3 weeks is when post-conception can take place. And that's where the pregnancy occurs, the implant of the sperm into the embryo. And that's where you really don't want to have caffeine either, because that can lead to a higher risk of miscarriage.
Whoa, very interesting.
Then the woman finds out she's pregnant. Drum roll, everybody, yay, hooray!
Right, mazel tov.
And then we go into the first trimester.
Right.
So during that first trimester, caffeine's a stimulant. We all know that. You've heard me talk about how caffeine boosts energy. It makes you feel more alert. It's consumed worldwide. The two major sources are coffee and tea, coffee being better than tea because I said so. And during that, and for all that, caffeine is considered relatively safe.
Right.
I don't recommend people go too much over 500 milligrams a day. And if you're sensitive to caffeine, you stay away from it later in the day. As my doctor said, as I told before, about dinner, so you don't want to drink too much caffeine after dinner.
Right. Watch the addiction, watch the withdrawal, but generally it's moderately, more or less safe.
Correct. It offers a whole lot of health benefits, in my opinion. But during the first trimester of pregnancy, there are potential risks. So the first risk is that pregnant women metabolize caffeine much slower than non-pregnant women. It can take 2 to 4 times longer to eliminate caffeine from your body if you're pregnant.
Whoa. So are you worried about a buildup of caffeine, kind of? And I'm sure it just affects differently as well based on the hormone changes and all of that. But are you worried about a buildup of caffeine in the body?
A person is worried about the buildup. What you're also worried about, though, is that caffeine crosses the placenta and enters into the baby's bloodstream,
Whoa,
raising
okay.
concerns that it can affect the baby's health. So there's a concept in medicine called caffeine clearance exam.
Mm-hmm.
And you can measure how caffeine clears in a person. And this is where the understanding of during the first trimester of pregnancy, a woman doesn't deplete caffeine as quickly as a non-pregnant woman does.
Whoa, that's really fascinating.
So the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology says that the amount of caffeine should be less than 200 milligrams per day in a first trimester woman.
So that's less than half a cup of coffee for... Wait, less than 200? So it's less than 2 cups a day?
Correct.
Okay.
And I'll go over those with you before we end the podcast.
Perfect. Okay. So now we're back to some coffee. And would you even say that it's maybe not a bad idea to do decaf? Like if you're feeling your own body and you think that, maybe decaf is a good option even here in the first trimester?
Yeah. So again, we're looking at coffee as a medicinal benefit drink.
Right.
So if we didn't, then the woman should just drink water. Good quality water has no caffeine, no calories. It's needed for hydration.
Right.
We're going to talk about coffee and hydration in just a second. But water is really healthy. If a woman wants to drink coffee, and why not, then if you're using Swiss water decaf where they're not adding chemicals to remove the caffeine, then there's nothing wrong with it. It still tastes great.
Getting those antioxidants.
It's still a nice beverage. It just doesn't have the amount of caffeine that a regular calf coffee does.
Right.
There is still some caffeine in Swiss water decaf coffee.
Yeah, I think we looked. It's about 5%. It's about a 20,
regular coffee is about 3% to 4% caffeine. Swiss water is about 1%.
Oh, okay. So, okay. Yeah, so that's a good point, and it's amazing to me how we're here at the first trimester, and already it's the children are so resilient. You know what I mean? Like already we're showing some tolerance here. I'd imagine, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but I'd imagine that later in the pregnancy that number of allowed cups of coffee is going to go even higher.
It is. It really made a lot of sense to me. I had a professor one time that was talking about you're not supposed to take X-rays or use an MRI on a pregnant woman.
Right.
And he was like, if you look at all the research in the third trimester, if a woman needs an MRI, that baby's not going to be harmed. It's already formed. There's not going to be any genetic, chances to the baby. And it really made me think about what happens during the different trimesters of pregnancy.
Seriously, that's exactly what I'm talking about. It's fascinating.
Yeah, so there are alternatives, by the way, to things a woman can drink during her pregnancy. She wants to stay away from herbs like ginseng. So there are a number of herbs that are unsafe for pregnancy. But there are some great herbal teas that are terrific for pregnancy. So you want to stay away from ginseng, chicory root, licorice root, fenugreek. You want to drink ginger, peppermint, red raspberry leaf is great, but you should first trimester should limit it to 1 cup a day. And lemon balm is a great herbal for pregnancy.
So you got to know what you're doing when you're doing the herbs, but the teas are a great option if you can't do the coffee. That's a good suggestion.
Teas are a great option. green tea or decaf green tea is a great option. Any of the decaf black teas are a great option. Decaf coffee is a great option. And water, always water is a great option. Let me transition into one statement that we'll go into when we talk about kids as well,
Please.
which is when they do these studies on caffeine, one of the problems is that they're not just doing it on purity coffee.
Exactly. That's true.
They're looking at caffeine intake from different sources. So when you look at 20 studies on children and caffeine, and you see that kids should stay away from caffeine, they're not taking into account that these kids are drinking all these energy drinks.
Yeah. Yeah, which are
Which
full of awful ingredients. We should really do a energy drink exploration one of these days, because it really does bother me, Dr. Steve. I'm not like a health crusader, but I really don't like how we give these energy drinks a pass, and they're full of toxins and garbage.
Yeah, and what they're also full of in many cases is sugar.
True. Very true.
And so you have to look at your habits, and there are certain bad habits, and there are certain bad habits that get reinforced even more when they're mixed with other bad habits.
Right.
So sugar and chemical caffeine is a lot different than a cup of black coffee.
Sure.
So many caffeinated beverages like sodas, obesity drink, they're loaded with sugar, which can lead to obesity, tooth decay. If a kid is slightly hyperactive, it's going to wind that kid up to even more hyperactivity.
Right.
There's a lot of problems, and they're not really talking about it correctly. Children who have an anxiety disorder, absolutely caffeine effects makes it worse.
Sure, that makes sense.
Parents that equate sports drinks and energy drinks as the same thing, the energy drinks have a significant higher amount of caffeine than the sports drinks usually do. So when they're equated as the same, then the parents are not monitoring how much caffeine a kid gets per day. And the same thing for pregnant women. I've seen pregnant women that say, I get really tired, so I have an energy drink.
Right.
Are you kidding me? You're getting a load of caffeine, a load of sugar. It makes no sense.
Yeah, not to mention the dyes and the taurine and all this other random junk. I don't know why it gets a pass, but we'll look into the energy drinks another day. Where did we leave off on we're moving into the second trimester here?
Yeah, so we're moving into the second trimester of pregnancy, and in the second trimester of pregnancy, a woman can start increasing her caffeine to about 300 milligrams per day, which is about 2 to 3 8-ounce cups of coffee.
Right on. So we're getting there. We're bumping it up to about where we need to be.
Yeah. And then the third trimester, a woman can go up to 300 to maybe creeping up to 400 if she's not having any ill effects from too much caffeine. Again, the problem is that with pregnancy, a woman decreases their caffeine load at a slower amount, and the caffeine does go into the the placenta barrier,
right,
and can affect the child. So I personally recommend that women during their whole pregnancy don't go over 300. Personally, the literature can show up to 300 to 400. I limit it at 300.
Okay, I love it. That's still plenty as far as the health effects go. When we talk about the dose-dependent health effects, that's a good place to be. So interesting exploration. Really, really fascinated by this. So you're saying that you've given these guidelines, but it also sounds like you have a pretty big caveat of you have to listen to your own body. Everyone is different, and especially during pregnancy, there are so many changes. You do have to kind of listen to your own body, right?
Absolutely. You really want to pay attention to your inner feelings about how you're doing and go with the gut. Always go with the gut.
Totally. That's so true, man. This next topic I wanted to explore, I've been dying to talk to you about this, man, because I was talking to a dear friend of mine. She's from Argentina, and she moved up here to the Midwest. I just absolutely love her. She's a huge coffee drinker. She's a huge Purity fan. But we were chatting one day, and she just straight up told me, because what did she say? How did it start? I think that she was wondering if she asked if I was going to offer my coffee to my daughter. And my daughter's like 4. And I'm like, what do you mean? And we get to talking, and it turns out in Argentina, they feed their kids coffee, children as young as 4, 5, 6 years old, coffee all the time. I was blown away by this. This is not something we do here in the States, but I also don't even think they do it in like Europe. I've traveled quite a bit. I've never seen kids drinking coffee. So what do you think about this culturally? And then from a health standpoint, what are your thoughts on giving developing children caffeinated coffee?
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I think if you follow what the what the FDA, I got CDC on my brain from COVID.
Yeah, totally.
The FDA recently started taking a very deep look at the effect of caffeine in kids. Now, I want to give you a caveat again, which I said before.
Yes.
One of the problems is that they lump caffeine from all sorts of sources, which includes caffeine that has sugar in it, caffeine that has artificial colors, artificial sweeteners. So I'm going to try and switch that up on people who are listening so they can get a clear indication of the difference between coffee and caffeine.
Mm-hmm.
What happened with the Food and Drug Administration was pretty interesting because Wrigley's, remember them, a subsidiary of Mars?
Absolutely. Wrigley Field here where I live.
That's right. So Wrigley's is promoting a new pack of gum.
Uh-huh.
Each piece of gum contains about 50 milligrams of caffeine.
Whoa. Interesting.
So one pack of gum is like having four cups of caffeine in your pocket.
That's really interesting. I guess that's cool. Again, though, if there are all these different sources of caffeine and coffee is already a superfood, that should really be the only one you're intaking, in my opinion. But I'm the host of the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast, so what do I know?
Yeah, so again, they're not interchangeable. Caffeine is not the same as coffee.
Right.
And so they're looking at adding caffeine to jelly beans, marshmallows.
Oh, geez.
All sorts of snacks. They're even thinking about putting it into instant oatmeal on the market so that people can have an energy eat.
Ooh, I don't know how I feel about that, man. It's a little bit weird.
Well, the FDA doesn't know how they feel about it either, so they started looking about this process. What's the fundamental question of the consequences of all these caffeinated products in the supply chain to children?
Right.
And so what they've come out with is that for healthy adults, the FDA has cited 400 milligrams a day. That's about 4 or 5 cups of coffee,
mm-hmm.
depending on how you brew it. And you and I have talked before about brewing methods and the amount of caffeine.
Right.
But they didn't set a level for children. They've looked at the different manufacturing process since the 1950s to see how caffeine is added to things. And they're putting out new regulations with regard to that. So let me give you the bottom line on that. Kids aged 4 to 6 should not have more than 45 milligrams of caffeine per day, which is equivalent to 1 can of Coke. But that's what I mean I have problems with because Coca-Cola is really good for pouring on your battery to get the
corrosiveness off. Yeah, you're right, man. This stuff's poison.
Corrosion off in your car, but I don't know that it's good for ever drinking. But that would be equal to about a half a cup of coffee.
Right. Okay.
Kids 7 to 9 years old, 62.5 milligrams of caffeine. Kids 10 to 12, 85 milligrams of caffeine, which would be, according to the FDA, equal to 2 cans of Coke. And teens would be about 100 milligrams a day.
Okay. And then so you're working
I
your way up.
personally, I personally do not like blanket statements.
Sure.
I think giving a kid who does not exhibit hyperactive behavior a cup of coffee a day is perfectly fine.
Hmm.
I think that you have to look at the kid. If the kid has any kind of attention deficit disorder or anxiety or learning disorder, you don't want to give them caffeine.
Well, my thought was when I was talking to my dear friend from Argentina, my thought was if coffee and caffeine specifically, again, we're not talking about drinking the Monster Energy drinks, but if this really did have a horrible negative effect on kids, wouldn't Argentina have like a horrible health problem? She acted like this is just what they do there. And I'd imagine that there would be a whole generation of stunted kids, short children or something, but there's not. And also when you say, 45 milligrams of caffeine, you give a kid a little half cup of coffee and you're there. So that's kind of what she was saying is you give them a little mini cup. So I don't know. It doesn't seem that outrageous to me. I certainly would feel weird like giving it to my young child, but I don't know. It's got the antioxidant benefits. It's got a lot of good stuff in there. It's interesting. I don't think most kids in America have a taste for coffee. I think that most kids would find coffee gross. And I think it's interesting that apparently there are some cultures that get them started young.
Again, I am not in favor of keeping kids away from coffee. I just said that negative to how it normally would, but I'm positive about giving kids coffee if they don't have some mental behavior.
Right.
There is zero studies that I have found that concretely look at physical changes like stunted growth, etc., and coffee consumption. There are no studies out there that are able to show a link. Now, there is some studies that show a mild link between pregnancy and a type of childhood leukemia with too much caffeine intake. But the studies are few and far between, which is why I really didn't reference that one. I don't want anybody to get upset. If they follow the guidelines that we laid out on this podcast about about preconception, postconception, first trimester, second trimester, everybody will be fine.
Wow, that's fascinating, though. I would love to learn more about if there is some concrete linkage there, what that is. Before we dive into our remaining few topics here, let me ask you this. How do you, this is kind of a 30,000-foot view, step back. And again, it's a very emotional take. Maybe as a doctor, this is the wrong way to approach it. How do you and how should we look at caffeine? It's looked at so many different ways. Some people look at it as a drug, like any other drug. Other people say it's beneficial. It's not like it's addictive. So it's this, it's that. How should we be looking at caffeine? Something that's beneficial in moderation? Is it closer to a supplement than a drug? What's your opinion?
Right. So, you and I have talked before about, let's say, a pregnant woman who has some nausea with pregnancy. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about giving a higher dose of vitamin B6 to help with the nausea. Mm-hmm. When you're using a higher dose of thing as a targeted treatment, that's when it starts to become a drug.
Oh, okay.
So we can use nutrition as a pseudo-drug therapy.
Sure.
Somebody gets sick and I want to give them high-dose vitamin C. I'm giving that for its drug-like effects.
That's a great differentiation.
Rather than telling everybody to eat an orange every day and getting some vitamin C.
That's a really good point.
So the caffeine that's part of the complex of coffee is really not being used as a drug.
Right.
If you want to start taking, look, I'm driving a truck, I can't, I'm tired, I'll pop these 10 pieces of Wrigley's chewing gum in my mouth, I'll chew it, I'll get myself 500 milligrams of caffeine, boom. I mean, that's using it for its drug-like effects.
Good point. I love it, man. Okay, we have a time crunch. This episode turned out to be strong, man. Let's talk quickly. We got to talk about coffee and sex, right?
Yeah, we can do coffee and sex and coffee and hydration really quickly.
Let's do it. Whichever order you want.
Let's start with coffee hydration.
Because you got to hydrate before sex, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, they talk about caffeine as being a diuretic.
Sure, that's what I've heard. I've heard, don't drink coffee because it'll dehydrate you. Drink extra water. What is your thoughts on that?
So it's not true. Coffee is classified as a diuretic because it makes you pee more.
Okay.
But it doesn't decrease the amount of hydration in the system.
Okay.
So you drink a cup of coffee and it stimulates you to pee, and you're going to pee away that cup of coffee, but it doesn't decrease the overall value of how much water you have in you.
Okay. Doesn't take water with it.
So it's really not true that it's classified as a diuretic.
Interesting. But you certainly don't count it towards your hydration content either.
You can.
So I read that, and I wanted to run it by you because I find that really hard to believe. When I don't have my water, I get a specific thirst that coffee just doesn't quench. But you say that it's part of your hydration protocol.
Yeah. So here's how I talk about hydration. You need 8-ounce glasses. I'm making this general. 8-ounce glasses of water a day. Water is water. There's nothing really that replaces water, because anything that you add, like Coca-Cola, and your body has to process it.
Right.
It has to process it by separating out the coca from the water.
Right.
Leaving you with a net negative because you're using the water in your system to process that.
Sure.
Coffee is considered a diuretic in the fact that it's supposed to cause this separation similar to Coca-Cola, but it doesn't. So what happens with coffee is that it really is dependent upon liver function as to whether or not caffeine clearance takes place as efficiently as it's supposed to.
Right. Okay.
And we can go through caffeine clearance in liver at another time, because I got a lot to say on that, so I won't say it today. But you can absolutely include the amount of teas and coffee as part of your water intake.
Man, that's fascinating.
Now, you can't do it if what you're drinking is mocha frappuccinos.
Right, because again, then there's a bunch of stuff in there your body's having to process.
Exactly. And you can't include it if you're drinking energy drinks for the same reason.
Sure.
But if you're having a black cup of coffee or a cup of green tea and 6 glasses of water, then that's perfectly fine. Make sure and make your coffee and tea with good water.
Okay.
That's always
That's the
and
answer.
If anybody ever wants to talk to me about water filters, they can reach out to me. We can talk about the different types of water filters.
Yeah, I know you're a big fan of the Vitev, and I have a Vitev myself. Interesting, man. Super interesting. And hydration is a big, facet in my health and wellness protocol. So I'm going to take a closer look at that. Let's make sure we have time, though. We have to talk about coffee and sex, coffee in the bedroom. European style, baby. What can you tell me about coffee and sex?
I can tell you that it's really complicated because when we look at caffeine intake, so it's not just coffee, it's caffeine intake. What caffeine beverages do is they constrict blood vessels and cause a momentary rise in blood pressure.
Uh-huh.
So what does Viagra do?
I was going to say, that sounds like a Viagra type reaction.
No, it's the opposite.
Oh,
Viagra type reaction dilates blood vessels.
Yes. So is it counterproductive? Are you going to talk about some impotency links here?
It's not. Well, I'm going to talk about erectile dysfunction and premature ejaculation.
Oh, fascinating.
So in the bedroom, heavy caffeine can cause anxiety,
Sure.
which can lead to a psychological form of erectile dysfunction
Sure.
and premature ejaculation. The constriction of the blood vessel makes it more difficult for the heart to get blood to the penis, which is necessary action for erectile dysfunction and control. Drinking caffeinated beverages decreases blood supply dilation, so it may lead to erectile dysfunction.
Jeez.
It may lead to the difficulty of getting hard, getting an erectile.
Yeah, getting an erection. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, there's a nice study out there in which they took rats, and they made them diabetic, and then they gave them caffeine and monitored erectile dysfunction.
Uh-huh.
And there was a positive correlation between caffeine and erectile dysfunction.
Whoa, fascinating stuff, man.
Yeah. So if you're having ED and you have diabetes or metabolic syndrome or hypertension, then you may want to consider decreasing the amount of caffeine, increasing L-theanine with your caffeine.
To clear it out?
L-theanine just stops the vasoconstriction and stops the increase in metabolic action.
Oh, that's right.
It's just really nice to use with caffeine. I'm a big proponent of L-theanine and caffeine together.
Wow. And then can counter effect the negative effects of caffeine, including the blood flow and erectile dysfunction effects. That's fascinating.
It can. And the other thing is talk to your doctor if you're having ED about using something like low-dose Cialis, which helps just keep the blood vessels opened, or beetroot capsules.
Oh, interesting. Never heard that before.
So my go-to for health is L-theanine, beetroot capsules, and Purity or some high-quality coffee.
Nice, man. Wow, fascinating stuff. I would have never guessed that, but it does make sense the way you talk about the blood vessels and the blood supply. Super fascinating stuff, man. Caffeine is a tricky one, honestly. It just seems like it affects everybody differently. Kind of like alcohol. Like most people can handle alcohol really well. Personally, I can't drink alcohol. It makes me sick. I really don't like the way it makes me feel. Some people can drink like a fish. It has to be largely your genetic makeup. And I know you've talked about that before. But it just fascinates me how this ubiquitous stimulant that completely powers the world, it's all around us. It's widely accepted, but it really does affect everybody a little bit differently.
Absolutely. So, Jordan, one thing I would like to talk about, since we've been talking about energy drinks and other things that affect caffeine usage, is we've put together a nice little book called Breaking Bad Habits.
Ooh.
And I'd be glad to send it to any of your listeners by email. They just need to reach out to you or me, doc@level1diagnostics.com. And I would be more than glad to email a copy of our Breaking Bad Habits book.
I love it. Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Coffee. And go get it, listeners. Thank you, Dr. Coffee, for this exploration today. This was a lovely caffeine deep dive.
I enjoyed it very much. Let's talk about liver clearance sometime, and we've got some other things that we can talk about.
We've got so many things on the plate, so you listeners need to stay subscribed to the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. This is Jordan River and Dr. Coffee signing off, wishing you an extraordinary day. We'll see you next time on the CHSP.